Hi, Rod Kane with the Washington Grand Company. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my favorite ancient medieval war game, Triumph. Triumph, this set of rules has been around for a little while as a PDF. It's just recently been released as version 1.1 in PDF form on Wargame Vault, and it's also available as a printed set of rules for purchase through Scale Creek Miniatures. Um, it's my favorite game. I joined the team a few years back, and I have to admit, after playing many different miniature rule systems, I really enjoy the system, hence the reason I joined the team. I've got the shirt. Um, but the main reason that I like it is it's a system where you get to play the strategies and the tactics of the ancient battles and not worry so much about the bog down of the rules or the charts. It's a fairly intuitive system. Um, you can play with as few as 50 to 60 miniatures, as you see before me. This is a 48-point standard army, but you can scale it up. I've used it to do the battles of Kadesh. I've used it to do the Battle of Hatton, Hastings, Liegnitz, other famous battles, and it plays these periods very well. It scales up very well. It works great for beginner players, so I use this to present convention games where people don't know the rules, walk up, learn to play, and play out a whole battle in an afternoon. And I've used this in tournament play against expert players and find it challenging and very enjoyable. So today I want to take a little bit of time to go through some of the basic mechanics, explain a little bit more detail about the games and its nuances, and we'll go through it together by looking at miniatures. So in Triumph, armies are made up of stands of different troop types. So I'm going to use these Greek armies as an example so I can explain a few of the different troop types and how we base the figures and why we do it the way we do. You'll see here we have some hoplites. The hoplites, as are shown here, are based up as heavy foot. The heavy foot, 4 to a stand. And you'll see next to them some light foot, which are 3 to a stand. Skirmishers, which are 2 to a stand. And on the end we have some rabble, which are 3 to a stand, but on a much deeper base. You'll notice that all the bases are the same width. However, they are different depths. The reason for this is not only does it help us identify the different troop types, but it also affects the way the troops move and how much space they take up on the table. So, for example, in Triumph, all the movement is done in terms of movement units. And so you can see that a movement unit is a half a base width. So this 4 stands is 8 movement units wide. When units are in combat and they lose the combat, they will withdraw their base depth. Well, if your unit has a deeper base, it obviously withdraws farther when it loses combat. So lighter troops, cavalry, tend to be on deeper bases, and that also represents that they tend to withdraw farther when they lose a combat. So these 3 different troop types, as you can imagine, will have different combat factors, different movement rates, and also different point values. The heavy foot, the light foot, and the skirmishers are all worth 3 points. The rabble are only worth 2. In Triumph, your troop types are worth anywhere from 2 to 4 points typically, and obviously the higher the point value of the troop type, typically the better its capabilities, either speed or combat, and value to the army in general. Let's talk about movement for a minute. So we now know that the smallest element or subsection of my army is a stand. If I want to move a stand in Triumph, I have to look up that stand's particular movement rate and move it measuring from the front corners. So for example, heavy foot, as you can see on this handy movement gauge, can go 3 movement units. So I measure the front corner. An individual stand can move 3, and I have to make sure that no front corner goes more than 3. So as long as the front corners didn't go more than 3, it's a legal movement. A individual stand can rotate, so you'll notice that it didn't go more than 3. It can even spin around as long as the corner that I started to measure from, the farthest moving corner, didn't go more than 3. So that's how you move an individual stand. But another way to move things in Triumph is to move them as a group. So let's say I wanted to move this entire line. What can this entire line do? Well, as a group, it can only go straight forward, or it can wheel. So if it wants to move straight forward, I look at the group and I say, what is the slowest moving unit in the group? 3 MU for the rabble. These lighter troops are faster, but since they're all going to go in a group, they can only go 3 MU. So I would effectively move my line a maximum of 3 MU, and the entire line could go straight forward. That would also be a legal move in Triumph. And one of the reasons it's important about this movement is, in order to move troops, you have to use command pips. Moving this individual stand, 1 command pip. Moving this group forward, 1 command pip. So as you're playing the game, you're going to find that managing your forces in groups and maintaining order in your line is going to be very important for controlling your command. We'll talk about that in another section. What if I want to wheel a line? In order to wheel a line, what I have to make sure is that no part of the line goes backwards. So a lot of people, when they tend to wheel a line, they want to wheel about the center. But you can't wheel about the center. You have to actually wheel about a corner. So you have to think about this corner being fixed in place, and the farthest moving unit moving its maximum, which would be this rabble on the end, going 3. So in order to execute this wheel, I measure. Nobody's going more than their max movement. I lock this corner, and I wheel the troops into position. And that would be a single group move or a wheel. I also could have taken the same unit, and I could have moved slightly forward and wheeled, once again checking that nobody's going backwards and nobody's going past their total maximum movement. So this would also be a legal group move. So keep in mind, groups can go forward, they can wheel and go forward. They can never go backwards, and they don't go sideways. So groups, while a way to conserve your command pips, it does limit and restrict your movement, while individual stands can pretty much move in any way they want as long as no front corner exceeds its maximum movement. Let's talk about combat in Triumph. So how do the stands fight? The majority of stands in Triumph are going to fight in base-to-base contact. So in a normal process of a turn sequence, we would move into contact. If there was any archery fire or artillery fire, that would happen, and the results would be taken immediately. And then we would conduct combat. This is normal front corner combat in Triumph. In this case, we'll push both lines together. So this would be an example of the 2 lines hitting. And then the person whose turn it was, who moved, would decide the order of the combat. In this particular case, you would roll a d6 and you would add your combat factors. So heavy foot, fighting heavy foot, you would have a +4 combat factor for each. You'd roll a d6 and then you would add the numbers together. And then the general results of combat would be determined by the high die. So let's say, for example, you have a 6 and a 3. We've scored a total of 10 here, and we've scored a total of 7 here. So the Athenian hoplites would actually retreat 1 base depth because they've lost the combat. Now, the person who is commanding the non-Athenian hoplites would have the option to continue the combat down the line here or go to the end. In this particular case, he'd probably go to this next combat because he now has what we call an overlap. There's no longer any support on this side of these hoplites, therefore they'll receive a -1 in their combat roll. So let's say in the next combat we roll a 4 and a 2 for our combat rolls. This will become an 8 and this will become a 6. However, it'll actually be -1 for the loss of support on this side, therefore making it a 5. Once again, the result would be a pushback. The heavy foot in this case would stay where they are. They don't follow forward. In the next combat roll, let's say we have a 2 and a 6. Now we have a total of 10, and in this case we have a total of 5. 4 minus 1 for the lack of support. This would kill this unit because the total score is double. Because they doubled, this unit would charge forward. So in Triumph, the typical result of a tie is nothing happens, and the typical result of a doubling is the other unit is killed. There are some exceptions to that. That's part of the elegance of the rule system. But basically, this would be the normal outcome. What you would expect when you're doubled in combat is that you would die. There are some units that, even when doubled, they don't die. So for example, a skirmish unit fighting a heavy foot unit, even if this skirmisher was doubled in combat, its abilities allow it to evade from heavy foot. So if the skirmisher is doubled, it will pull back. The heavy foot will charge forward, but the skirmisher simply evades. An evade move officially is pull back 1 base depth and then retreat straight back 4 MU. And it would pass through anything that might get in its way. The only thing that would stop it would be if it ran into some impassable terrain. If it evades off the edge of the board, it would be destroyed. But that's one of the abilities of the skirmishers. And because the Hoplite was doubling the skirmisher, it would charge forward. So this is one of the elegant things in the system, is that the different troop types get their abilities from that result table. But the mechanics are always the same. Roll a 6-sided die, add the combat factor, plus or minus any effects from overlaps or being surrounded, and then determine the results from the table. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about the turn sequence in Triumph. I kind of skipped over that because I wanted to explain what stands and individual units look like first, and how they moved and how they fought. But let's say you have these two opposing lines. Triumph is a what you see is what you get game. So there is no counters, there's no charts that you have to keep track of, there's no stats that you have to track from turn to turn. When you look at the table, whatever you see is exactly the situation on the battlefield. When you have your turn sequence, it's basically I go, you go. A player's turn consists of rolling for command pips. We use a 6-sided die for that. So if I rolled a 2, I would get to do exactly 2 things. And as we discussed in the movement section, moving 1 unit would be a thing. Moving this entire line of hoplites, including the skirmisher that's attached on the front, forward, or wheeling that would be a thing. So I can do 2 things. So with those 2 pips, for example, I might choose to move my hoplite line closer. I might choose to move those 2 rabble down there on the end into a position to take advantage of that rough terrain. But I can do 2 things. So on my turn, I roll my command pips. I do whatever my command pips allow me to do for movement. Then if we were to have any long-distance missile fire, we would take that opportunity to shoot. Now, in Triumph, you'll notice that I have missile troops on the board, or at least people would say, well, there's missile troops right there. I've got bows, I've got slings. However, in Triumph, in the scale that we're working with, we don't represent the missile fire from small groups of bowmen in skirmish mode. We only use missile fire in this range for massed archery. So we have a unit in Triumph called archers. We have units in Triumph called pavis. We have artillery. Those will actually fire at range because they fire massed volleys. The skirmisher's ability to fire a ranged weapon is determined in its ability we talked about a minute ago, where if it's fighting these heavy troops, it looks like they're in base-to-base contact. Well, they're actually getting really, really close and throwing slinging rocks at them, or shooting arrows, or using crossbows or handguns, which means they're not really closing into hand thrown weapon range. So essentially, if you have a weapon that outreaches a hand thrown weapon and you're a skirmisher, you have the ability to run away if you lose combat because you're not getting that close. Anybody who has got hand thrown weapons does have the risk of actually being killed in the combat results table. So with the two armies that we see here, we would have movement, combat, combat results. And the combat results is done for each individual combat immediately, and the effect is taken immediately. So in the case of these two lines charging forward, part of the reason why you'll see I've deployed these skirmishers out front is because the idea is that the skirmishers can do exactly what they're supposed to do, which is interfere with the enemy line. If these skirmishers move in and attack these heavy foot, and they get doubled in combat, which is very likely because you have a +4 for the heavy foot. The skirmisher is a +2 against foot, but it's got an overlap here and overlap here, so it's got double or -2, double overlap. Skirmisher is going to likely lose, be doubled. It's going to back up, and then it's going to evade back. And this guy is actually going to charge forward, chasing the skirmisher. So the idea is to use those skirmishers in front of that heavy foot line to break up the enemy line. Once I've broken the line up, if I'm close enough with my main line, I can go in here and attack this guy and get a double overlap on him with my heavy foot and have a better chance of creating a hole in my enemy's line. So this is kind of how a Hoplite shield wall battle might take place, is you'll use the skirmishers to break up the enemy's formation so that you can take advantage of them, hopefully gain some advantage locally and make a hole. Another way to use the skirmishers, or the light troops, as you'll see on the end here, I have some light troops. Those light troops are really, really fast. So the idea with the light troops on the end is, assuming the cavalry wasn't there to stop and protect from that, is the light troops are fast enough to swing in and hit the enemy in the flank. This is another way that I can stop my enemy from retreating. Should I win the combat, I would destroy the units in front of me. One of the advantages to hitting the flank is, one, it gives them a minus to their combat roll, and two, it stops them from falling back from a loss of combat. So, as you can see, in a battle like this, it's going to be very much about trying to break the other guy's formation up, break his line, and try and wrap the ends if you can, or put a hole in the center so that you can get an advantage somewhere. Now, we talked a little bit about combat previously, and what I want to show you now is the result of falling back when you have troops behind you. So, in this example here, these hoplites fight, and let's say the Athenians were to lose the combat. In this situation, they do have troops behind them, however, they are aligned with their front edges in parallel, so the front rank of hoplites would simply push the rear rank back, and that would be the result of a loss of combat where they weren't doubled or destroyed. Now, that works just fine as long as everybody's lined up and you can do an orderly withdrawal from combat. However, if the hoplites behind them were turned at some angle and not lined up with their front, these hoplites, if they lost the combat, would have no safe place to withdraw and they would be destroyed. Same thing goes for rear. So it's a really good idea if you're going to try and create formations with a bend in them, make sure you have a clear path to withdraw behind the units that are at risk. Otherwise, they can be destroyed by not having a place to withdraw from a minor loss of combat where they would normally be okay if they fell back. This is for closed order troops. In the situation with the skirmishers, which I have on the table as well, the skirmishers are a troop that has a special ability to pass through anything or be passed through by anything. So in this case, when the hoplites fell back with skirmishers behind them, they would actually pass through the skirmish unit and end up behind the skirmish unit. Same thing would apply if the skirmishers were the ones doing the combat. If they were to fall back, they would pass through the hoplites and end up at the rear of the formation. So Skirmishers have the ability to pass through anything. Closed order troops, and we're going to talk about troop types a little bit later, closed order troops tend to push back the troops behind them. As long as everybody's aligned and the units are in order, you can move back and forth with the ebb and flow of the battle. When things get disrupted, when troops are not aligned, falling back in this situation would be the end of this hoplite stand. Now we've talked about front corner to front corner alignment in contact, and that is what we call combat contact. But there are a couple other forms of combat contact. If the front of a stand covers the complete side of a stand, you also have combat contact. The corners can be aligned, or it can just be covering the side of the stand. This is combat. This unit would fight at a -1. You can also have combat to the rear. So if you attack somebody covering the rear corners, that is combat. This unit fights at a -1. We talked a little while ago about falling back. So in this particular situation where we have a flank contact, in the flank contact situation, if the Athenians were to lose, this front corner would switch to the place where this front corner was, and then they would fall back. If there was anything that prevented them from switching their position, for example, if there was another unit here, and when they went to turn, they were blocked, or if after they turned, there was a unit preventing them from falling back, they would be destroyed. So as long as they can turn and fall back, they're okay. If the Athenians, which are fighting at a -1, were to beat the enemy hoplites, they would actually fall back just like normal. The Athenians would remain to face. In Triumph, getting hit in the flank can be very costly. If this unit survives the combat, remains locked in this position through a tie or some other means, in order to turn these on the Athenians' turn, they would have to spend command pips to reorient this formation and turn and face their enemy. Or they can choose to continue fighting at a disadvantage. Same thing with the rear. If they were to lose the rear combat, they would turn, face their enemy, and fall back, assuming they hadn't been destroyed by being doubled. If after turning they could not fall back, they would be destroyed. Now what happens in the situation where you have front contact and flank contact? We showed this a little while ago with the skirmishers wrapping in the line. Combat is always prioritized to the front. So in this situation, these hoplites are supporting. They provide a -1 penalty to the Athenian hoplites. These hoplites would be the main combatants. So you fight here, +4 for these hoplites, +4 -1, so a +3 for the Athenians. If the Athenians lose because their flank is wrapped, they cannot retreat, they are destroyed. Now, since I have the JavCav on the table today, I do want to talk a little bit about them. JavCav mounted in these Greek armies. These are the light horse. Their abilities and skills were ride up, harass the enemy, and escape. They were used for scouting, they were used for harassment, they were used for flanking. The reason I want to mention them here is I mentioned earlier that the combat factor is versus foot for the hoplites, +4. Everything has a combat factor versus its enemy. Hoplites versus foot are +4. Versus mounted, they're only a +3. Mounted weren't their favorite enemy. They weren't really equipped to handle the mounted as well. They were equipped to defend from the mounted, but they weren't really equipped to aggressively go after the mounted. They're too slow, and they didn't have the missile weapons or the ranged weapons to stop the mounted. The Javelin Calvary, basically these are cavalry that don't have a long-range missile weapon. They're typically not heavily armed, and they're fighting in a loose formation. They're going to ride up, they're going to harass, they're going to throw something, and then if things get bad, they're going to dance away. So the Javelin Calvary are a +3 versus the hoplites. The hoplites are going to be a +3 versus the Javelin Calvary. In this situation here that I'm showing you, see that the Javelin Calvary are double overlap, so they actually be a +1, so at a disadvantage. However, they have the ability against heavy foot. If they were doubled, they would actually just back up and then evade 4 MU away from the enemy. Now, that doubling would cause the hoplites to pull forward, and so as you can see, the JavCav are another unit that's very useful, like the skirmishers, for breaking up an enemy formation or line, pulling them out of formation, making them spend more command pips to move their formations, or possibly allowing the hoplites to get in on the single element that came forward and trying to double up on them. Javelin Calvary are very fast. They're also very useful for hitting in the flank. The Javelin Calvary travel a full 8 MUs for their movement. So as you can see, the Javelin Calvary compared to the heavy foot, which only move 3 MUs, can ride circles around the heavy formation. In a later video, I plan to do a piece about all the different troop types in Triumph and explain some of their pluses and minuses, their strengths and their weaknesses. So we've talked about some of the basics in Triumph, and now I want to kind of give you an aerial view or overall view of a battlefield and what you need to play a game. So what you see in front of you on the table are 2 48-point Hoplite armies. As I mentioned earlier, it's about 50 to 60 figures to make an army like this. You'll need a rule book, obviously, or the rules. You'll need a set of dice. A couple of measurement sticks are good. You can make up your own, or you can see I've made some fancier ones that I like to use because they have all the information for the different units on them. You also need a table space to play on. Now, Triumph is played based on the base widths on larger table if you have larger base widths. So, for example, in this situation, 28mm figures on 80mm wide bases, I'm using a table that's a little bit more than 4 feet by a little bit more than 6 feet because I'm using the 80mm metric system. But a 4x6 table will work nicely for 2 armies of this size. These are 48-point armies. Another thing that's very handy to mention is it's good to have a command stick. This is used to not only break up the table into different sections for when you're laying out terrain, which is something we'll talk about in the setup of a game, but it's also important because I didn't mention this before, but there is a figure stand that represents your general in both armies. Now, the general in the army is important in that he is the center of your army and he's the center of your command radius. So all of your troops, I mentioned earlier, it takes a command pip to move a group, it takes a command pip to move a stand. That is assuming that they have a general and he's within command range. Command radius is pretty generous. It's 16 MUs. So 2 of these 8 MU sticks, or this nice command stick, is the radius which he can command. His command is not blocked by troops, but line of sight is blocked by woods or a village or certain other pieces of terrain that could block his view of his troops. But enemy troops and other troops on the battlefield do not block it. As long as your general is in command, it only takes 1 pip to do one thing. But if the general is not in range of your troops, or if the general unfortunately is dead, your troops will take extra command pips in order to move them. So what you see in front of you here is enough miniatures to play a game. You'll also want to have a nice game mat to play on, and preferably some nice looking terrain which you can move your troops on. You'll see over here I have some rough terrain. This rough terrain also, I have a shadow image of it underneath, because if I start to move troops onto it, it looks really cool, but it's not very practical for putting troops on the little hills. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've had a chance to learn a little bit more about the game. I'm going to do some more videos on detailed aspects of the game and the different troop types in the future, and I hope you'll tune in and watch those as well. Thanks.